Hi, everybody. How's everyone doing this afternoon? I am coming on to talk to you with my friend Jamie Ivey. A lot of you are friends with Jamie. And we are going to continue our series, Back from the Border. And maybe you've seen this, but every week we've been talking with women we have had the pleasure of hosting down at the southern border. And there's a lot going on at the southern border right now. And so we are gearing up to take another trip in June. And so I am pinging all my girls who went on trips to tell us a little bit about their experience and why they went in the first place and what was their biggest takeaway. So Jamie's going to talk to us about that too. So I'm sure she'll be on just one second. I just let her in. We'll give her a second. There she is. Hey, friend.
Hi, sweet friend.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Are you in your office?
I am in my office.
Okay, like color coordinated books going on back there.
Yeah, it's not my style, but I see other people do it and I like it. So I tried it and everyone comments on it. I love it.
And it looks great. I should probably do something with whatever, but looks good for you.
Well, thank you. That's not actually like what looks, if I was at my computer, you would just see a blank wall. So, it's like this over here and then this is the side. So I figured this would be better for our Instagram live.
Yes. And I legitimately, I have just stuff shoved, in all the places. And you just okay, let's just be real about what it looks like. Okay, so we're going to talk about the fact that you went to the border. Not only has Jamie gone to the border with Women of Welcome, she's gone twice. She went once almost 3 years ago, I think. And then she was like, I want to take some friends. So let's talk about this in our series Back from the Border. So first question, friend, why did you say yes the very first trip, which was probably almost 3 years ago now, I bet?
It was in August of 2019.
Okay, so why did you say yes in the very first place to go to the southern border? You live in Texas.
Yeah. I think there were a couple reasons. Number one, I trusted the people that invited me. So that was important to me. I think it's so hard, and you guys, Women of Welcome, are constantly battling this of we hear noise and rhetoric and conversation from all around us that sometimes we feel like, what's actually true? What do I actually believe? Because I hear a governor saying this, or a pastor saying this, or a leader saying this. And so I trusted the people, and I trusted them because they had proved true in their love for the Lord and their love for people. So that was a big thing for me. Also, like you said, I live in Texas. And so what happens at the southern border, it feels a lot more relevant to me than if I lived, for example, in Nebraska. It's not any less relevant in the eyes of God because it's people, but it did feel a little closer to home with proximity. And so that mattered to me. And then the third reason for me also is I literally wanted to be educated. If people don't know, my job is an interviewer. So I host a podcast called The Happy Hour, and we have conversations with people about all different types of things. And I really wanted to be someone who could have a conversation about immigration and refugees and what's happening at the border, and have a little bit of knowledge to be able to ask thoughtful questions. And so that was also that for me. And frankly, also the fourth reason is I just actually wanted to see with my own eyes what I heard about on the news. And so that was really important for me as well.
Yeah. So you went once, and what would you say was maybe your biggest takeaway from that particular trip?
So from that first trip, which was, if we think back to the timeline, it was August of 2019. So we were probably in the election would have been in 2020. So we're already starting to hear, and lately in the past couple of elections, there's a lot of conversations about immigration and what's happening at the border. So that I would have been hearing that in my own state for the upcoming election. And so for me, I had a lot of preconceived ideas about what had happened. And I think, Bree, you can correct me with this, before that August of 2019 trip, is it before that when we were seeing a big uptake in families and children in the cages?
That was, it's all been kind of intermixed, and the dates and whatnot are a little bit squishy. But what you are entering into was this heightened rhetoric of immigrants, refugees coming to the border and them coming as takers and whatnot. And then as soon there was lots of narrative about families being separated. There were kids in cages narratives out there. Yes, absolutely. But I think you are coming in, uh, I guess the rhetoric was still incredibly heightened at that time as well. So
yeah, so incredibly heightened rhetoric, and I wanted to go down and see that. So I came in with a lot of preconceived notions about particular people who might be at the border, and I don't necessarily even mean. I had two preconceived notions about people who were working at the border, like as in like security and government officials. I had some preconceived ideas about them. And I also had preconceived ideas about who's actually coming to our border, because I think that this is a longer conversation, but I think from different sides of the political spectrum, we will get different preconceived notions about the people who are handling security and the people who are entering our country. And so I had both of those coming in. And the thing that I remember leaving that first trip with was I have more questions than I have answers. I expected to go down there and then get all my questions answered and have it all figured out and be like, oh, I know what's happening. And I left going, I have no idea what's happening. But what I did come home with, although I came home with more questions, I came home with more empathy. And what I would say about that trip is because everything that I saw, it was more than just a news story. It was more than rhetoric. I actually saw people, I actually saw problems, and I actually saw some like people who were trying to be a part of the solution. And so, although I came home with a lot more questions, I also came home with stories. So now when I hear a story about a man at the border, I think of the man that I actually heard his story of why he was at the border, rather than just a man who's coming in, who's probably part of the cartel and smuggling drugs in and wants to take all of our children, our jobs. I don't think of that person the way it's presented to me anymore. I think about a human being.
right. And I think a lot of people, during the previous administration, when we took delegations down to the border, I think people were really surprised that it wasn't like there were just a bunch of people flooded, pushed up against the border fence. Like, there were lines of people for sure. But I remember in particular that trip, we went over to Juarez and we went into a shelter. We heard from a man who came to the aid of a young child in his neighborhood, in his apartment building, and therefore his engagement there put him in danger with the local cartel. And so then he fled by himself in order to seek asylum and then also send for his family. And in that story, I remember walking back across the border into the US and seeing, as the media readily portrays, a single line of men lined up at the fence at the border crossing. And I remember thinking, I will never look at a line of single men lined up to get into the country different. Like, I'll never look at them the same after having that conversation, because the way that people are portrayed, like you said, was very different from the stories that we had heard. And so I saw them, it just humanized that line. Yeah. I looked at that line very differently on the way back, very empathetically on the way back.
Something similar happened on this most recent trip that I was on with you in November, and we can talk more about that trip. But I don't know if you remember this, in one of the shelters, the same shelter where, I believe it was the same shelter where they also were skinning an animal to like eat and stuff. That same place.
Yes.
We met a young man who was single and alone, but his wife, who was pregnant, had already gotten over because she had a family or contact or someone in the States, and she delivered their first child in the States, and he was still waiting to be able to join her. And so there was another example of a single man waiting to get in. But once you know the whole story, you no longer think of it as this crazy, scary single man trying to get into our country. Yeah.
Yeah, and to take advantage. Yeah, so it definitely humanizes the conversation, and it makes you look at those images from the media very differently, or at least we hope that it does.
And on the flip side too, I told you this before, I very wrongly came in thinking not bad things, but just really questioning a lot of the Border Patrol issues, and imagining and placing these Border Patrol officials as the worst people in the world. How could they do this? Where's their conscience? All these things. And probably one of the biggest things for me was they became human to me as well after that trip. And, that's why I'm saying both parties, if we take politics, which always gets put on top of things, they will grab onto something to kind of make you think something that is maybe partially true or not all true at all. And I had a false narrative about Border Patrol agents, you know, and was able to see, man, over the years, people coming into our country has so drastically changed that the system hasn't caught up, and the people working hasn't caught up, and the processes haven't caught up. And so obviously, are there some people who are, you know, maybe not as kind in their job as they should be? That's everywhere. But I also walked away going, wow, like we also need to help our systems at the border be more efficient and be able to take more people in a kind intake manner. And so I came away from that first trip also going, well, we have like an issue here at the border of like, maybe people are being treated inhumanely because there's not enough staff.
There's a mismatch, right? And
Yeah.
just how we were talking about how Border Patrol is there to enforce the law. They're there to understand and be knowledgeable about what is coming across the border. They're not daycare workers. They're not social workers. They're not health intake personnel.
Not medical professionals.
So, yeah, they're not. So what they were dealing with, because of our policies and because of the push factors of what was happening in Central America during that time, which is still very much happening today, but there was just this surge there. What was very apparent to me is that we were continuing to meet a humanitarian crisis with a military response. And we were expecting Border Patrol to warm up baby bottles in the offices, the intake offices, and that women and children would be just fine in cement block cells that were designed and made for single men who were going to be very quickly deported out of that situation and just go straight back to Mexico. And these families, they were families, 2, they were from Central America, and 3, they had a lot of needs and tender age children. And so that you just, again, you start to pull back some layers, and you hopefully as Christians, you immediately find your compassion button that might have been covered up for a while in this space. So So here's the thing, though. Anytime we go down to the border, it's not like we're coming back as experts. It's not. These are listening and learning trips, obviously. The very first time I went down to the border I knew it was going to change my heart in a lot of ways. And I knew it wasn't going to be like a feel-good trip. I guess I just didn't anticipate being hit with like an emotional semi-truck of how badly we're missing this in the church. And but you came down, and then you asked Brie, I want to take friends, let's take more people, which was, I mean, obviously incredibly encouraging, but like you wanted to go back again, and you wanted to take people with you. Why did you want to do that?
I still want to do it again. Like, let's make another trip, Brie.
Okay, you heard it here.
The greatest gift that I have in my job is hearing people's stories. And I think that hearing someone's story that is different than you, it creates an empathy in you that you could not have maybe mustered up on your own. Like, stories really help us see the world. And so a lot of times what's happening at our border or with immigration, a lot of times for a lot of us in this country, we could go our whole lives and it might not affect us very much.
Right.
Like if you own a business, it might affect you, or if you live on a border city, it might affect you. But honestly, Brie, I could live my life in Austin, Texas, and hear Governor Abbott talk about things, hear, President Biden talk about things, and still kind of go, I don't know, it doesn't really do anything to me. I'm not seeing this on my bottom line in my business. I'm not feeling this emotionally or socially within my world.
Right.
And the thing that I've loved about my show is because I have been exposed to things that I wouldn't normally be exposed to, and it has changed me. Like, I'm a better person because of that exposure. But being exposed to those things, you have to sometimes seek it out, and you have to be willing to sit in a lot of yuck and pain that most of us, frankly, would rather avoid.
Right.
And so who wants to feel these things? Nobody. But we are better people and more like Christ when we actually feel the things that other people feel. And so for me, going down there and putting myself in a situation where I had to hear someone's story that made me feel, frankly, very uncomfortable. And I had to see what was happening with my own eyes and understand the tragedy of what it looks like to be people who, as followers of Jesus, should be welcoming, but we don't emulate that within our churches, and even some policies within our country are not equal for all people. And so I had to go sit in that. And for me, the thing I wanted to do the most is, how do I also invite people to sit in this with me? And so, because I do that on my show every week, of how do I invite people to listen to, for example, John O's on the show today, how do I invite people to listen to his story of embracing joy and sorrow at the same time? Well, I've created a podcast about it. And so I thought, the way I'm going to invite people is I'm going to invite my friends. And the reason that my friends would say yes is because they trust me the same way I trusted you guys this first time I went down there. And so I said, hey, I want to be a representative and say, hey, I trust Women of Welcome. I trust the bar. I trust the people who are going down there to visit. You trust me. Let's go together. And it's life-changing. I was just two things have come up in the past month that I want to share with you. When I took that trip with Bree, I invited some of my friends who are also kind of maybe might do what I do. They might be authors, they might be podcasters, pastors. And we went down, and I also opened up a trip for happy hour listeners, which we should do this again. And I took people who listened to my show. We took 10 women down there, and it was really, really great. And I saw one of those women last week, and I got to speak to her and her husband. I met her husband for the first time. And he was able to say how much that trip had changed his wife's life. And she was able to talk about how she was still so changed from that. I met another woman just yesterday. I was at an event in Dallas, and she said, I went down to visit. I went to the border. I went to see a bar. And I was like, who'd you go with? And she said, I just went on my own because I've heard you talk about it so much. And her life was changed. She literally went on a trip with the bar. There were 3 people on the trip. I mean, how awesome is that? Yeah. But so that's what I wanted to do, is if people can trust me and I can tell them about it, then they can experience that. And because it changes your whole perspective as a Christian, as an American, as a woman. It changes everything.
Yeah. And it's so funny because you just never know what God is going to do through you stepping out in faith to do things that make you really uncomfortable, and what it will inspire people to do. So you might look at, you might not have a lot of followers, or you might not have a lot of influence, or you know what, like that stuff doesn't matter when it comes to kingdom impact necessarily, And so what I mean by that is not the first story I have heard of a woman say, I heard what you were doing, your trip filled up, so I went on my own. And there's a woman, it's one of my favorite stories in Women of Welcome. Her name is Carla, and I talk about her all the time because I was just so floored by her. Jenny Yang and I were speaking at an event in Dallas with Tess Clark, and this woman came up. She had driven up to Dallas Baptist University, and she came to listen to us speak. And afterwards she said, I have watched all the videos. I have watched the documentary. And I wanted to go on a trip with you guys, but the trip filled up. And so I just decided to take some of my girlfriends. We went down by ourselves. I was like, Carla's like my mom's age. I'm like, Carla, you did what? She was like, yeah, and it changed my life. And now I have a small group in my church, and I've been giving my pastor all the stuff from the evangelical immigration table. And she's like, my heart has been lit on fire, and I had no idea that it was there. Now, it doesn't come without some cost. People will talk about when they engage with this issue, or even just other issues that are, human dignity issues that are complicated and messy. There's a lot of tension to be had. I know in Carla's family, her family was really skeptical of her engagement in this space. They were very politically aligned and oriented one way, and felt like it was a bit of a betrayal for her to enter and engage with this issue. And as we've kind of stayed in touch with her as much as we can, she's like, it's a work in progress. She's like, I'm learning as I'm also trying to learn. And so she's like, I didn't come back an expert, but man, my heart has been lit on fire, and I feel like this is something that God has given me. And yet, it wasn't that you did something or I did something necessarily to impact her one-on-one, but that she saw other women doing something really courageous, and she decided to do it herself.
Yeah. And it also helps you have a little bit more sturdy ground to stand on. So like for me, example, there's a lot happening in my particular state right now with our governor talking about how Title 42.
Look at you, Jamie.
Thank you. With Title 42 being lifted, and so there's a lot of conversation and rhetoric coming out from my governor in my state of Texas, that I kind of look at it and go, I don't know that he's telling, I don't know that all the facts are there, or that sounds like he's giving us half of what is actually true. And because I've been to the border and I've heard the stories, and what he's saying, I don't feel is the full picture. So it gives me a little bit more of empathy to say, like, I actually am not going to believe rhetoric that says every person coming across our border is a part of the drug cartel. I'm not believing that. I'm not going to fall for that trap. And the reason I say I'm not going to fall for that trap is because I've met people in the shelters who are wanting to come across the border. So it changes the way I even see things. It gives me a little bit more of compassion on what's happening. I already told you, like, I learned to have compassion for the Border Patrol agents. I have compassion for our lawmakers who are trying to wade into this space that is nuanced and complex and hard and difficult. And so it's just made me think about issues that maybe I wouldn't have had to think about, particularly before this.
It gives you pause.
It gives you pause. That's exactly right. Where you go, I'm going to think about that more, and I'm going to read more, and I'm going to go to a couple different news sources to see what I can gather about what's happening right now at the border, because that makes me pause. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, we always talk about at Women of Welcome is that we are 100% nonpartisan, and that we want to engage this issue from a biblical perspective first. And so if you feel compassion towards this issue, Women of Welcome's job is really just to attach confidence to that compassion, biblical confidence, but then also just equipping and educating you to understand the headlines and the policies that are coming down and whatnot. But I do feel like getting close in proximity gives you a holy pause to really engage well, or engage better than maybe you did before. I think all of us, especially that have grown up in the church, know all of the things we're supposed to say, and know all of the alignments where we're supposed to line up. We know all of the echo chamber sounds and nuances, and it's very comfortable to stay in those places because that's just how we grew up. That's evangelical culture. This is what we do. And yet it does feel, I feel like some days, having existed in that space for so long, it didn't feel life-giving to not try and crack open some of the real depth that was missing from those echo chambers, and that's missing from some of that culture that's just been so ingrained in us to just dismiss people so easily without truly trying to enter into their space and see where they're coming from.
It's so true. I think that echo chamber, it allows you to stay there. You don't have to engage with people who are different than you, because you know exactly what you believe and why you believe it, and this is what it is. Well, that echo chamber only exists for the people that it benefits. Like, if you think about it, like, that does not, no one else is living in an echo chamber except for the people that it benefits. You know, it's like the same example of, I think different about prison systems now from a Christ standpoint, from a biblical standpoint, because I have spent time with women who are incarcerated. And so when you spend time with people who are not living in that echo chamber that you've lived with, it changes the way you think about them. Immigrants, it changes the same thing. People at the border, being a white woman, learning from my Black sisters, that changes the way I think about things. And I think that's why it's so important, the work that Women of Welcome is doing, because you are helping women engage in something that, I've said it before, quite honestly, that they could go their whole life with not having to engage with. But going your whole life without having to engage with it, you're missing a whole part of, like, loving God's people and believing that every person is made in the image of God, and therefore they deserve to be safe and seen and secure and known. And how do we as a church be a part of that in our world right now, who is having to welcome people into our country who look different than us, who worship different than us, who think different than us? And how do we do that looking like Jesus? And you guys, I mean, I'm like y'all's biggest fan. And listen, what you guys who are watching this, what you wish you had is Bree's cell phone number. Because what I do is I just text her and I say, Bree, tell me what's going on here. But you guys have Women of Welcome.
Oh, man. Well, you know, Jamie and I have talked about these kinds of issues kind of at length. You know, we have an IG live that we did together, and then we have a podcast that we've done together, and then obviously really good friends in this space with Jenny Yang and Tess Clark. And I mean, there's a plethora of people, and there's a lot of good information out there. But one of the things we talked about in some of those conversations were some of my big aha moments. But on your second trip that you went on, did you have an aha moment? Like, you'd already gone before, you're going back. Was there something that stuck out to you in that second trip that you went, when you invited all your friends to go, when you invited happy hour ladies to attend? What was your biggest takeaway then?
For those trips, my purpose, like I've already mentioned, was to expose my friends to something that I thought was beneficial to them. And so I will admit, like, full disclosure, that a lot of my time was spent thinking, how can I help them see what I want them to see and what I think they should see and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the things that's always cool, whatever you do in life, is to be a part of someone who's seeing something for the first time and almost like reunite something within you. One of the things that I really, really enjoyed on that second trip was meeting an organization stateside that really was helping people with getting to where they needed to be. And it was a part that I didn't see the first time. And so I think that's why it was probably a little bit more of an aha for me, was it was when, and Bree, you can explain how the system works, but when they were released and then they were heading to where they're going to be for their family, their host,
with a sponsor family,
with their sponsor family. That in between part, which is vital for a lot of reasons. It's vital for safety. It's vital for just understanding, like, you're in a new country with a new language for most people. Like, how do we get from, El Paso?
Where are we supposed to be? And
how do I get from El Paso to Cincinnati, Ohio, And so meeting that organization, it was just another reminder for me. It was a church. It was hosted at church. It was just another reminder of me of the church really stepping up and finding a need and deciding how can they meet that need. And so I was just another thing of like, oh, this is a thing that the church can actually be a part of in their local communities, which that's in El Paso. And of course they're dealing with people who are waiting to get to their host families. But we have churches all over the country who there are refugees coming to their cities right now, today, as we speak. And that's a whole nother conversation, but there are so many ways that the local church can get involved in their community with refugee work without heading to the southern border, which I know that's a trip you're taking, but I just wanted to say that too.
Yeah. Yeah. So last question, because I know we're running short on time and we were going to try and keep this conversation short, but I feel like that never really actually happens when we get together. So my last question to you is, with this issue and with a lot of issues, I feel like people, they kind of dip their toe in the water and then they realize how complicated it is. And so then they're like, wow, I'm never going to be an expert on that. So I'm not exactly sure I'm ever really going to speak up on that. And I'm just going to kind of hang out here as a wallflower. Like, you guys go do you, and that's great. And I'm with you, but it's like silent wallflower. What would you say to people who are on the outside of this issue looking in and haven't taken any steps yet to engage either with the issue, with whether that's as simply as reading something, following people, or engaging their local community? If you're on the outside looking in, what's your encouragement to people?
I think a lot of times you have to figure out, why am I just on the outside looking in? Like, what's the reason that I won't take a step forward? And I just want to acknowledge that for a lot of people, it feels very politicized. And so they either don't want people to know, like, what if my friends or my parents or my partner knew that I was actually stepping into this space? I think a lot of people too are just like, I'd rather not know. Like, I'm living my life perfectly fine. I'd rather not know. And I can fall into that bucket sometimes of like, man, if I just don't look at the images that are happening in Ukraine, then I can just forget that that's happening right now. And so I think we have to really acknowledge, why is it that I don't want to engage? And then say it out loud, verbalize it, and then think, man, what can I do to combat that? Because really, neither one of those are healthy. It's not healthy to say, I'm going to act like this doesn't exist. And it's not healthy to be afraid of what people are going to think about you, because this topic has become so politicized, even though Women of Welcome, like you said, is bipartisan. We're talking about how to be Christ followers in this issue. And so, but there is a fear. And so I would just encourage people to really acknowledge, what is it that's keeping you from engaging, and then saying, is that worth it? Like, is it worth it for me to just close my eyes and act like it doesn't matter? And I mean, as a kingdom-minded set, you might think it's worth it today because you got a lot on your brain. The last thing you need to do is see pictures of children who are, vulnerable and either are separated from their families or murdered or whatever it might be, of course I would choose not to put that, because that takes emotional power. It takes like time and space and love and compassion, empathy. But is that kingdom minded?
Well, and I mean, in Matthew, like you just said, it has kingdom implications. Like you don't have to be 100% knowledgeable or an expert in this issue or any other issue in order to do right by the issue or to do right by the people who are affected by it. So, in Matthew, when Jesus is saying, like, I'm going to separate the sheep from the goats, and the disciples are like, well, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you sick, imprisoned? When did we see you disenfranchised, Lord? And the Lord's like, well, anytime you saw anybody else and you didn't engage with them, you were dismissing me. Anytime you did engage, you were serving me. And so it's one thing to, I feel like, live a shallow, very protected Christian life. And it's another thing to engage because this has eternal kingdom impact and implications. And those things are two very different things. And we're called to one and we're called to dismiss and run from the other.
I agree. And I think also for me, there's a lot of people who may be listening who are either teachers or aunts or their mamas or their daddies. They are around children. And I think one of the biggest things that I actually personally, like, not even kingdom minded, not even with my show, not even like the empathy that I've learned, but personally in my life, is that I get to have conversations when I see something on the news with my kids in a different light than I would have before. And so really, if you think about, like, I know my show reaches a lot of people and this is all great, but I got 4 people in my house that I get to have conversations with about things that I think matter. And I think it matters the way that we treat people. And I think it matters the dignity that we put on people's lives. And so if nothing else, me heading to the border and me meeting men and women there, it changes the dignity that I see. I should have obviously, and I hope I did have that, but I'm just saying, seeing with your eyes and touching people with your hands and looking and hearing people's stories, it changes things for you. Yeah. And so then I get to be a person who talks to her children in a different way. I get to talk about people in a different way.
Yeah, you actually then are actively affirming people's dignity, and seeing that these are image bearers worthy of your time, worthy of your conversation, worthy of your compassion and empathy. My daughter is kind of like, she's just a little mini me, and so she's
amazing.
I'm sure she's going to be an Enneagram 8 like me, and just but the other day I must have the news on way too much, because my 4-year-old is talking a lot about Ukraine winning the battle and Russia needs to go home, and they made a very big mess, and I'm like, whoa, I need to turn off the news. But it's also very cute, just his age appropriate interpretation of what's going on. But my daughter, I remember her saying, you bring up how to talk to your kids about this. I remember I was looking at some image, and I was obviously emotional about it. And my daughter said, what's the matter? I said, oh, it's just, there's a mom at the border. I just found out her story, and she's unable to get across, and her son is dying. And my daughter immediately was like, we just need to let everybody in, Mom. Like, why don't we just, can't we just love everybody? And I mean, just, she don't know much about the issue at all, but that's where she went. And I just said, babe, I wish it were that simple, but it's not, because not everybody can be here. Not everybody should be here. There are some people who aren't safe to come into the country. And that's why we do have to have secure borders and an effective system. And right now it's not working for the people that it should work for. And it's categorizing, and the narrative is categorizing people all in one light. So you get very vulnerable people who are lumped in with people who really shouldn't be in the country. And then, and then she just kind of, like, when I broke it down like that, she's immediately like gung-ho, but I said that to her, and she was like, okay, so what do we do, Mom? Like, how do we get her help? And then it just was this really sweet conversation about a woman that she's never going to know, never going to meet. And yet she was already trying to think about how to solution something for someone that she will never encounter, and a place she will probably never go to. And it was just a really awesome conversation to just have with my kids. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, friend, thank you so much for always being such a big support of what we're doing. But just thank you for entering into the space and inviting other people to enter in as well. I know that we have so many in the community that have said, Jamie inspired me to come, or Jamie inspired me to just keep watching and leaning in. So thanks, friend.
Love that. Thank you for the work y'all are doing, just making a difference.
Well, we're all just trying to do the best we can, right?
Yeah. All
All right, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Talk to you soon.